Welcome to History Class with Dr. W. If you are one of my students, I typically assign this lecture as an introductory lecture, thinking about why we study history and why a course like this might be required for college students. But if you're listening to this lecture as someone outside of one of my courses, by all means, stick around and get one historian's impression of why history matters and why it's important for everyone to study history. I'm going to begin by looking at just some popular quotes about what other folks have thought history is all about. These come from other historians or philosophers or scholars of one sort or another, and perhaps some of these quotes will strike you and your own experiences in learning history. Arnold Toynbee tells us, history is just one damn thing after another. And Thomas Carlyle says, history is a great dust heap. Perhaps you've heard this famous quote from James Joyce, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. George Santayana says, a country without a memory is a country of madmen. And Schopenhauer has this wonderful quote, Clio, the muse of history is as thoroughly infected with lies as a street whore with syphilis. What a beautiful way of putting it. And then we have these two quotes, very similar, coming at things from slightly different perspectives. The historian Kenneth Stamp, who says, knowledge of the past is a key to understanding the present, and Lamartine, who says, history teaches everything, including the future. And then I'll conclude with this quote from Mark Twain. The past does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. So in these various quotes, we get a lot of different thoughts about what history might mean to one person or another. There are a few quotes in there that reflect on perhaps history can be dull. It's a lot of names and dates and things that might not seem all that important. And I guess depending who's teaching it and how they go about it, that might be your experience as well. Then there are quotes like those in the middle that talk about how history can teach us things about the present or perhaps even the future. And we're going to talk a good bit about this as I go through the rest of this preliminary lecture. But I'd like to conclude with this quote from Mark Twain, who says the past does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. It's a common cliche that history repeats itself, right? But that's not really true, or not literally true. History doesn't repeat itself, but there are many things about history that kind of remind us or echo in the present tense. And that's how I like to think about it. And one of the things, students will sometimes say, well, when am I ever going to use this? Now, I'm sort of biased here, of course, but I use history all the time. I'm constantly thinking and reflecting about how things going on in the present remind me about things that I've learned about from the past. So with those kind of general thoughts about what history might be, let me talk about 5 specific things that I think history can provide for us. 5 things that we want to think about as we go through this course or any process of learning about history. To summarize quickly, history gives us a sense of identity. It gives us empowerment. It gives us our legacy, gives us judgment, and history can give us joy. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So history gives us identity. And we can think about this in terms of collective identity. If we think about sort of a national identity for our country, where can we find that? Well, there is no single national religion. Race does not unify us necessarily. There's no one gender or ethnic identity. There's no one class. All of these things are very disparate across society. But what brings us together is a common history, a common set of experiences that we have all in one way or another gone through, and that creates for us a collective identity, a sort of national identity. But this is also very important in terms of individual identity. If someone asks you, talk about yourself, tell us who you are, and tell us a little bit about yourself. Well, you're not going to get very far without starting to talk about the past, whether it be your own past, where did you grow up, what was your childhood like, Or more importantly, who were your parents? Who are your grandparents? Where did they immigrate from? What is your family kind of experience? So individual identity is going to be located in our history. There's a very popular show called Finding Your Roots with the historian Henry Louis Gates, and he walks various celebrities back through their family tree and tracing their ancestors. Every episode ending with someone in tears or powerfully moved at the people they've learned about from their past that they might not have known existed, and it just gives them depth to their individual identity. Now, history also gives us empowerment. Obviously, I don't mean physical empowerment or military power, but the power to make change, the power to think about the present, to think about the future, because we understand our past. We talked about the Santayana quote that a country with no memory is a country of madmen. So let's kind of think about the inverse of this. If you don't know anything at all about where we have come from and about the past, where does that leave you? Well, one example I like to draw from is the book 1984 by George Orwell. And this theme is very prominent in that book, history and memory and empowerment, or more to the point, disempowerment. Some of you perhaps have read that book or heard about it. The all-powerful evil entity in that book is Big Brother. Of course, there's a popular television show with that name. There are cameras everywhere in that show watching everybody. So Big Brother is this all-powerful entity. And the first thing that Big Brother does in trying to disempower the human race is takes away their memory. He takes away their history. So by not understanding where they came from, they can't really process what's happening to them in the present. Let me read you just a little bit from 1984 by George Orwell. And the main character, whose name is Winston, reflecting on his condition. Winston tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with blocks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard, and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions? But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lit tableaux occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. So Winston cannot remember his past. He remembers nothing of his history, and thus he is kind of stuck in this perpetual present, and he can't really make sense of it. He's powerless to make change. And I think while that's a fictional example, it certainly holds true of all of us. If you don't know anything at all about where we've come from and about our history, then really, how can you process the present? How can you think about the future without knowing anything about the past? A kind of related point to this is that history gives us our legacy. I'm a big fan of the musical Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and perhaps many of you are as well. It's an incredibly powerful musical. History and memory is one of the major themes of that musical, and one of the famous lines in one of the songs goes, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" In essence, how are you going to be remembered? Or are you going to be remembered at all? Perhaps you're going to be forgotten. And in some ways, this musical has revived our collective memory about Hamilton, who was, for a while there, sort of a forgotten founding father. So history gives us our legacy. Now, without getting into the religious elements of this kind of ties into the afterlife, or what is left of us after we're gone. The ancient Greeks didn't believe in heaven or hell or an afterlife. They believed once you were dead, the only thing left of you was your legacy. What did people remember about you, and what did they say 100 years later, 200 years later, 1,000 years later? And so for all of us, history provides us that legacy. Related to that, history gives us our judgment. And so if history is our legacy, it also judges us in some ways. Historians will someday tell, what kind of person were you? Were you a good person trying to make positive change and doing good things in society? Or were you perhaps a villainous character doing negative things and committing crimes or horrible things? History gives us that kind of judgment. History also judges us collectively. And I call your attention to the document on the screen. And we don't have to go into great detail about this, but this was a bill brought up in Congress in 2019, creating the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans. And so this is a bill that's looking back on possible reparations for the wrongs done to African Americans under slavery and after. This is only one of many different examples of this. There are similar kinds of bills over time related to the Jews and the Holocaust. And should they be sort of repaid, and how could they be repaid for the wrongs that were done? There are similar kinds of bills related to Native Americans and wrongs done to them historically. So history calls us to judgment as a society for the actions of the past. Now there is one final theme that I want to bring up here. One other thing that history can do for us, and that is history can bring us joy. Oftentimes my history students find this to be the hardest to believe. But bear with me. If you pay any attention to Hollywood films, think about how many blockbuster films every single year draw their themes from history. Among the recent ones are the film 1917, Harriet, Mary Queen of Scots, Ford versus Ferrari, First Man, Hidden Figures, and the list is endless. You can also check the bestseller list of novels and historical narrative books people enjoy reading, like David McCullough's John Adams or the various books of Erik Larson, which always seem to be bestsellers. I've already mentioned the musical Hamilton, which has made such a profound impact across our society. Now, many of you might not believe that history can bring you joy, but I would challenge you to think about whatever you are interested in, whatever your major might be or your interest. Maybe you're interested in science, it might be music, it might be art or literature, any number of other things. All of those things have a history, and I bet you enjoy or at least take interest in learning about the history of whatever your chosen field might be. Maybe you're a passionate sports fan. Perhaps you enjoyed the documentary The Last Dance about the Chicago Bulls of the 1990s. Well, guess what? That is history as well. So whatever your chosen field is, whatever you enjoy, you must take part in that history and draw some joy from that as well. So I think there's a part of all of us that is drawn to history and takes a great joy in learning about history. So I would invite you to open your mind to the possibility that some things you will learn about in the coming course will bring you joy, will entertain you, will put a smile on your face. I'm not going to say every single part of every lecture will do that, but there will be parts of every history course that you take that will bring you joy. With that, I invite you to continue to the next lecture. I'll see you next time.